My son slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table and told me to sign away the company I spent 35 years building. My daughter sat right there and didn't say a word. So I looked at Darnell, set the pen down, smiled and told him I needed to think about it. Then I walked to my room and grabbed the suitcase I had packed 6 days earlier. My name is Clifford Caldwell. I'm 67 years old. And the man sitting at that table, asking me to hand over everything I ever built, was my own son. I want to tell you how that morning happened because it did not come out of nowhere. Nothing like this ever does. Harriet passed 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, gone in 11 months from the day they found it. We were married 41 years. After she died, the house we shared for 30 years felt like it was made of cardboard. Every room had her in it. I could not walk past the kitchen without seeing her standing at the stove. I could not sit in the living room without hearing her laugh at something on TV. So when Darnell called me a few months after the funeral and said I should come stay with him in Loretta, I told him I would think about it. What I did not tell him was that I had already been watching him for close to a year. I own King Properties. I started it in 1994 when I was 37 years old with $18,000 in savings, a contractor's license, and a piece of land on the south side of Atlanta that nobody else wanted. I built it up deal by deal, year by year, through recessions and market crashes, and a dozen moments where I thought the whole thing was going to fall apart. By the time I handed Darnell the acting CEO title 2 years ago, King Properties managed 14 commercial buildings across 3 counties and had just under $40 million in assets under management. I gave Darnell that title on purpose, and I gave it to him carefully. My attorney Monroe had spent 6 weeks building the safeguards into the arrangement. Darnell had the nameplate, he had the salary, he had the office on the 4th floor with his name on the door. What he did not have was the shares. He did not have the trust. He had not signed a single ownership document because I had never asked him to sign one. I want to be honest about something. I gave Darnell that position because I loved him and because I wanted to believe he had grown into the kind of man who could carry something like this forward. He was smart. He had good instincts when he focused. He knew how to read a room and how to talk to people. For the first year, I let myself think it was going to work out. Then Monroe called me on a Tuesday morning and told me to look at the company's expense account. Percent $8,400 brash on a weekend trip to Miami. $3,200 on a watch purchased at a jewelry store in Buckhead. Thump $6,000 in cash withdrawals across 6 transactions. All processed as business expenses, all with no supporting documentation. I sat at my kitchen table that morning and looked at those numbers for a long time. I did not call Darnell. I did not call Monroe back right away. I poured a cup of coffee and I thought about something Harriet wrote in her journal the year Darnell was in high school. She wrote that she worried we were making things too easy for him. She wrote that she loved him more than she could put into words, but that she was afraid he was learning to receive instead of build. She wrote that she hoped she was wrong. She was not wrong. Over the next 3 months, Monroe and I documented everything. The charges kept coming. By the time I made the decision to move into Darnell's house, the total unauthorized spend had crossed $67,000. There were also 3 contracts he had signed on behalf of the company without board authorization, deals that could expose King Properties to liability if they were not carefully unwound. And there was a pending wire transfer of $67,000 to a personal account that had not yet cleared. I moved into Darnell's guest room with 1 small suitcase and a plan. He thought I was a tired old man who needed family around him. He saw the flannel shirts and the reading glasses and the way I sometimes asked him to explain the software on the company's new platform. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. What I was actually doing every evening in that guest room with my laptop and a secure line to Monroe was building a case file. Darnell's house was nice. Big kitchen, 3-car garage, the kind of neighborhood where everyone's lawn looks freshly cut. Loretta kept things running smoothly. She was polished and organized, and she had ambitions that were a size too big for the life they could actually afford on Darnell's salary without the company propping them up. She was not mean to me. She was simply indifferent in the way that people are indifferent when they have already decided you do not factor into their future. Claudette came by on Sunday mornings sometimes. She lived across town, taught high school English, and had a garden in her backyard she talked about more than almost anything else. She and Darnell had always been close, and over the months I was living there, I watched Darnell work on her slowly. He told her I was getting forgetful. He told her I had said things that did not make sense. He told her the business was suffering because I kept second-guessing decisions he had already made. He was building a narrative, and he was building it carefully, because he knew that if things ever went sideways, he would need Claudette to back him up. I let it happen. I did not correct the record with her because I needed Darnell to feel safe. I needed him to keep moving, keep spending, keep signing things he had no authority to sign. Every week that passed, the case file got thicker. The morning he put the transfer papers on the table, I had been packed for 6 days. Darnell came into the kitchen that morning wearing a suit at 7 a.m., which told me everything I needed to know. He had rehearsed this. Loretta was behind him, standing in the doorway the way people stand when they want to look casual but have already decided how the conversation ends. He put the papers on the counter and slid them toward me. Full ownership transfer of King Properties, signed over to Darnell Caldwell, effective immediately. He had even had the signature line tabbed with one of those small yellow sticky arrows, the kind notaries use so you do not have to think about where to sign. Just follow the arrow and hand over 35 years of your life. Dad, he said, you're 67. You've done your part. I've been running this for 2 years. It's time to make it official. Just sign and we can all move forward. Claudette was at the table eating breakfast. She was looking at her plate. I looked at the papers. I looked at Darnell. I thought about Harriet in that hospital bed in her last week. How she held my hand and told me to keep looking after our kids even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I thought about the first building I ever bought, a broken-down warehouse on the south side that every other buyer had passed on, and how I spent 14 months rehabbing it nights and weekends while working a day job because I did not have the money to do it any other way. I set my spoon down and I said, "Let me think about it." Darnell's jaw tightened. He had expected me to either sign or argue. He had not prepared for calm. "Dad, there's nothing to think about," he said, and his voice was harder now. "You live here. We take care of you. The least you can do is stop holding on to something you can't manage anymore. Either you sign this, or maybe it's time we talked about you finding somewhere else to stay." There it was. The thing he had been building toward for months finally said out loud. I stood up slowly. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I did not say anything angry. I did not raise my voice. I just said, "You're right. Let me sleep on it." I walked down the hall to the guest room. I opened the closet. The suitcase was sitting right where I had left it, packed since the previous Tuesday. I carried it out through the kitchen, past Darnell still standing there with the papers in his hand, past Loretta in the doorway, past Claudette, who finally looked up from her plate. I did not say goodbye. I walked out the front door, down the driveway, and got into the car that was waiting at the curb. Otis had been my driver for 22 years. He took the bag without a word, put it in the trunk, and opened the rear door. "Where to, Mr. Caldwell?" he said. "The Westin," I said, "and call Monroe. Tell him we're starting phase 1. We pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the house. By the time I was checking into the hotel, Monroe had already made the first call to the bank. Every account Darnell had been accessing under the acting CEO authorization was frozen. Not closed, not flagged for fraud yet, just frozen pending a review by the primary account holder. That was me. It had always been me. The second call went to our financial auditor. The $67,000 pending wire transfer to Darnell's personal account was canceled and marked for investigation. The third call went to our 2 largest business partners. Monroe informed them that a formal audit had been initiated and that any agreements signed in the past 6 months by the acting CEO were under review. All pending transactions were temporarily suspended pending verification of proper authorization. By noon, Darnell's phone was ringing every 10 minutes. Business partners he had been negotiating with were suddenly unavailable. The company's operating account showed 0 accessible balance from his login. Every credit card tied to the company account was declining. He called me 24 times that afternoon. I watched the phone light up on the desk in my hotel room and let every call go to voicemail. That evening he called Claudette. He told her I had done something irrational. He said I was confused. That Monroe was taking advantage of a man who was not thinking clearly, that the whole thing was going to blow over once someone talked sense into me. He told her she needed to come over so they could figure out how to handle the situation together. He was still running the same play, even now. Build the narrative, lock down the allies, control the story before the truth could get in. The next morning I had an appointment I had scheduled 2 weeks earlier. I spent 4 hours at Atlanta General with Dr. Nathaniel, Chief of Neurology, full cognitive evaluation, memory and recall tests, processing speed assessments, a 90-minute interview with a panel of 3 doctors. When it was done, Dr. Nathaniel sat across from me and told me my cognitive function was in the top percentile for my age group. No signs of decline, no indicators of any degenerative condition. Fully competent to manage my own affairs, financial and personal. I asked him to put that in writing, notarized on hospital letterhead. He had it ready in 20 minutes. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. Let Darnell try to have me declared incompetent. That door was already closed and locked from the inside. On day 5, I set the trap. I had been thinking about how to do it for weeks. I did not want to manufacture anything. I did not want to plant fake documents or create a situation that could be challenged in court later. What I wanted was for Darnell to hand me the evidence himself, in his own handwriting, with his own signature, on his own timeline. The best traps are the ones where the other person walks in because they want to. Monroe and I had already moved the Fletcher Street warehouse into my personal trust 4 months earlier, back when the audit first started turning up problems. It was a quiet transaction, handled entirely within the trust structure, with no announcement and no reason for Darnell to look for it. As far as he knew, that warehouse was still a company asset he could touch. I sent Claudette a simple text message. I told her I was thinking about selling the Fletcher Street property and that as acting CEO, Darnell would need to countersign the transfer authorization to move things forward. I asked her to pass it along to him since he was not returning my calls. I want to be clear about what I was doing. I was not asking Claudette to deceive her brother. I was passing a message through a family channel, the same way people do every day. She had no reason to think there was anything unusual about it. Darnell called Monroe within 2 hours of getting the message. He was cooperative, almost enthusiastic. Monroe sent the authorization paperwork over that afternoon. Darnell signed it without reading past the cover page and sent it back the same day. His signature on a document authorizing the sale of property he had no legal right to touch. Timestamped, witnessed, notarized by his own notary at his own office. That was the piece Monroe had been waiting for. What I had not planned was what happened next. Claudette was at Darnell's house the afternoon he signed the paperwork. She had stopped by to drop something off, and she ended up staying for coffee. She was in the kitchen when Darnell took a call in the next room. She heard him clearly through the open doorway. He was talking to Loretta, who was out somewhere. He said, "The warehouse deal gives me the leverage I need. Once it goes through, I can tell Monroe that Dad already agreed to liquidate and use that to push the full ownership transfer. He's not going to fight it once the money starts moving." He laughed at something Loretta said. Then he said, "He thinks he's still running things. He hasn't figured out that the whole setup was designed to move him out." Claudette stood in that kitchen and did not move for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, walked to the front door, and left without saying anything to her brother. She drove across town and came straight to the Westin. When I opened the hotel room door and saw her standing in the hallway, she looked like she had not slept, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Her eyes were red. She had been crying in the car. I let her in. We sat on the balcony overlooking the city, and I told her everything. I started from the beginning, from the first call Monroe made to me about the expense account, through the 3 months of documentation, through the decision to move into the guest room, through every phase of what we had built. I laid it all out in order, the way you explain something to someone who deserves the full picture. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked out at the skyline. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed Darnell to feel safe, and because I wasn't sure yet what you knew." She looked at me when I said that. I could see it land. She understood what it meant, that there had been a period where I did not know which side of this she was on. She did not get defensive about it. She just nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are accepting something that is fair even if it hurts. She said, "What do you need from me?" I told her about the authorization she had unknowingly passed along. I told her that her account of what she heard Darnell say on the phone would matter in the civil case Monroe was preparing. I told her I was not asking her to go after her brother. I was asking her to tell the truth about what she had witnessed. She said, "Okay, just that. Okay." No drama, no conditions, no negotiation about what it would mean for the family or how Darnell would react or whether there was another way to handle it. She just said, "Okay," and I believed her. We sat on that balcony for another hour without talking much. She asked about the boat I had been looking at down in Savannah. I told her about it. She told me about a new variety of tomato she was growing in her garden that was giving her trouble. Regular things, quiet things. It was the most normal conversation I had with anyone in months, and I realized sitting there that I had missed my daughter more than I had let myself acknowledge. When she left, I called Monroe and told him we were ready to move to the final phase. He said, "When do you want to call the board meeting?" I said, 2 weeks. Give them time to read the full audit report before they walk in the room. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. in the King Properties conference room on the 4th floor of our downtown building. I had not been in that building in 4 months. When I walked through the lobby, the receptionist looked up and her face changed in a way I recognized. Not surprise exactly, more like relief. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. Monroe was already in the conference room setting up. 7 board members, 2 senior business partners, and a court reporter hired to transcribe the proceedings. The table was long enough that the far end felt like a different room. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. The chair fit the same way it always had. Darnell arrived at 9:05. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal gray one he saved for client meetings. He walked in mid-sentence, talking to someone on his phone, and then he saw me sitting at the head of the table and stopped. He looked at the board members, he looked at Monroe, he looked at Claudette, who was seated 2 chairs to my left, not across from me, not at the far end. 2 chairs to my left, close enough that there was no question about where she stood. Darnell sat down. He set his phone face down on the table. He straightened his jacket and looked at me with the careful expression of someone who is deciding in real time how to play the next few minutes. Monroe stood up and walked the room through the audit findings. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He simply read from the report, line by line, with the supporting documentation projected on the screen behind him. The $67,000 in unauthorized transfers broken down by transaction, date, and merchant. The 3 contracts signed without board authorization, including the estimated liability exposure each one carried, the pending wire transfer that had been canceled. The Fletcher Street warehouse authorization, signed by Darnell 10 days earlier, attempting to convey rights over property he had no legal claim to, and the transcript of the conversation Claudette had heard in Darnell's kitchen, which she had provided to Monroe in a signed written statement. It took 22 minutes to get through all of it. When Monroe sat down, the room was quiet. One of the senior partners was looking at the table. 2 of the board members were looking at Darnell. Nobody was looking at me, because nobody needed to. The report had said everything that needed to be said. I looked at my son. "You've been running my company, Darnell," I said. "I want to know one thing. Did you think I wasn't paying attention?" He opened his mouth. I held up my hand. "That's not an invitation. I don't need an answer today." I slid the audit report down the table until it stopped in front of him. "The board is going to vote now." The vote took 4 minutes. Darnell was removed as acting CEO effective immediately. His salary and all associated compensation were terminated. Monroe filed the civil suit for misappropriation of company funds before noon that same day. The IRS referral for the income discrepancies went out the following morning. Darnell did not say anything dramatic when the vote was read. He did not argue or threaten or make a speech. He just sat there looking at the report in front of him. And for the first time since I had moved into his guest room, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had taken something that did not belong to him and had been caught doing it. Loretta left 6 days after the accounts were frozen. I heard through Claudette that she moved in with her sister in Marietta. I did not ask for more details than that. The civil case took 7 months to resolve. I did not enjoy any part of it. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes people hear a story like this and they imagine the person who was wronged sitting back and enjoying the process of watching it all unravel. That was not my experience. Every deposition, every document request, every hearing felt like picking at something that was not going to fully heal. Darnell was my son. Whatever he had done, that part did not change. The moment that broke me open, in the way that things break you open whether you're ready or not, was during the evidentiary hearing when Monroe read from Harriet's journal. He had found a passage from November 1996. Harriet had written that I came home one night with bandaged hands and would not tell her what happened until she found a hospital billing notice in my coat pocket. I had burned my hands working a side job on a construction crew, an extra shift I had taken on to cover Darnell's private school tuition for the spring semester. The regular income was not enough that month. I had not told her because I did not want her to worry. I had not told the kids because I did not want them to feel like a burden. She wrote, "He does this so they never have to know what it costs. I hope someday they understand. I hope Darnell especially understands because I think he is the one who needs to learn it most." I sat in that courtroom and looked at the table in front of me and did not move for a long moment. Claudette was beside me. She reached over and put her hand on top of mine and left it there. Darnell was ordered to repay the full $67,000 plus legal fees. The IRS opened a separate inquiry that resulted in back taxes and penalties. He had to sell the house to cover the initial judgment. His professional reputation in Atlanta real estate was finished. Monroe had made sure the audit findings were shared with every firm that had done business with him. He did not go to prison. The civil judgment was significant and the consequences were real and lasting, but he was not a criminal defendant. That was a line I had made sure we stayed on the right side of. Not out of softness, but because I had no interest in destroying him completely. I wanted him to have to live with what he had done and find a way to rebuild from it. That seemed like a harder sentence than anything a judge could hand down. I retired for real about 3 months after the civil case closed. Handed King Properties over to a board I had spent 20 years building, people who understood the company the way I understood it, and walked away without looking back. I bought a boat I had been thinking about for years and had it moored down in Savannah. I named her Harriet. Most mornings I'm up before the sun. I make coffee on the small galley stove and sit out on the deck and watch the water change color as the light comes in. It is the most peace I have felt in years. Maybe the most peace I have felt since before Harriet got sick. Claudette drove down to visit me about 6 weeks after I moved aboard. She brought a bag of tomatoes from her garden, the troublesome variety she had finally figured out. We sat on the deck and ate sandwiches, and she told me about a student she had been worried about all semester who had finally turned a corner. I told her about a pelican that had been landing on the bow railing every morning for a week. We did not talk about Darnell. There was nothing left to say about Darnell that the courts had not already said more clearly than either of us could. About 8 months after the trial, Monroe drove down from Atlanta with a plain white envelope, no return address. Postmarked from a zip code in Decatur that I did not recognize, inside was a handwritten card. Claudette had not made it. The handwriting on the front was Darnell's. He had drawn a small picture on the cover, rough and simple, just a few pencil lines. It was a bowl of oatmeal. I sat with that for a moment before I opened it. Inside he wrote, "Dad, I know there's nothing I can say that covers what I did. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what Monroe read in court. Mom's journal, I didn't know about the construction job. I didn't know about any of it. I've been thinking about it every day since." There was a folded check tucked into the back of the card, $500 drawn on a bank account I did not recognize. At the bottom of the check he had written, "First installment. I intend to pay back every dollar." I looked at that check for a long time. $500 against $67,000 was not a repayment plan. It was a signal. It was a son telling his father that the process had started and that he intended to see it through. I put the check in my wallet next to the small photograph of Harriet I have carried since the day she died. I called Monroe and told him to reach out to Darnell and get an address. Then I called Claudette and told her what had arrived. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to write him back. I was not going to rush anything or pretend the last 2 years had not happened. But I was going to write him back, she said. "Good, I'm still on the boat most of the time. I fish in the mornings and read in the afternoons, and sometimes I drive up to Atlanta on a Friday and have breakfast with Claudette at a diner near her school. She always orders the oatmeal. I order it too now. It is the kind of thing that means something once it has meant something, and I do not want to let it go. I do not know yet what happens with Darnell. Some things take as long as they take. I am 67 years old, and I have learned that patience is not the same as giving up, and that waiting for someone to find their way back is not weakness. It is just love with a longer timeline. What I know is that I spent 35 years building something honest, and when someone I loved tried to take it from me by convincing me I was finished, I was not finished. I was watching, I was prepared, and when the time came, I did not lose my temper or make threats or do anything I would have to apologize for later. I just let the truth do the work. That is the part I want you to carry with you. If you have been underestimated by someone who should have known better, if someone close to you has confused your patience for weakness or your silence for surrender, I want you to know that those two things are not the same. Patience is a strategy. Silence can be a weapon. The man who stays calm when everyone expects him to fall apart is the most dangerous man in the room. Whatever you're dealing with right now, hold your ground. Document everything. Trust the people who have earned it. And do not let anyone rush you into a corner before you're ready. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Tell me about a time someone underestimated you and what happened when they found out they were wrong. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I will see you in the next one.